Yo, this is my KGSSHV 500 voltage amplifier. Today we're going to be replacing the four largest capacitors in this amplifier. This amplifier was built in 2010, so it's about 13 years old right now. And I've owned it for about 5 years. So the sound is well known to me. The sound is very bassy and the highs are a little bit attenuated compared to my favorite amp right now, which is the KGSSHV Carbon. So let's crack open this amplifier, replace the capacitors, and see if it makes any difference in the sound. So as you can see, this amplifier is built like a tank. It has an RK50 potentiometer, which is the most legendary volume control out there, which costs about $1,000 by itself. And there are those four large capacitors there. They are 450 volt 680 microfarad capacitors, and we're going to be replacing them with these 500 volt 680 microfarad capacitors. Hopefully they fit. The 500 volt capacitors are wider than the 450 volt ones, and we're gonna see if they fit in and don't bump into each other. These capacitors are really no joke nowadays. This capacitor alone goes for $40 each on Muser Electronics in 2023. And the reason why I'm replacing these capacitors is they are 13 years old now, and I don't really like the sound of this amplifier anymore because of its bassy sound. And so I'm going to be replacing the capacitors to see if there's any difference in the sound character. I highly doubt that there's going to be any improvement in the sound, but this is just a nice hobby project that I'm doing today. After I remove some of these wire locks here, remove the wires, I can unscrew the board from the case and then access the capacitors more easily. When you're disassembling electronics like this, it's always a good idea to take a picture of the circuit board to get an idea of the orientation and the setup of the wires before you take them apart. Alright, I was able to remove the circuit board from the case. It was a fairly easy process of removing some screws, some wires, and so now you can see the 680 microfarad capacitors that are 450 volts. Those are the ones that we are replacing. To help me with replacing the capacitors, I have my trustworthy Hakko FR301, which is a solder vacuum. You simply put the solder head near the solder joint that you want to remove, then you just press the vacuum button once the solder starts melting. And so far it's been very useful in replacing components on circuit boards for me. Alright, after about 40 minutes of elbow grease, I was able to remove all four of the capacitors. If you've gotten this far in the video, I really don't recommend doing this procedure because you have a very high risk of damaging the solder pads, as I did here. Even with the right tools, the solder pads can be easily damaged by these large capacitors because the capacitors are very tightly bound to the circuit board, and when you remove them, the only tip that I have is to use some solder flux or some nude solder to resolder the joints before you suck them up with your solder wick or the solder vacuum to help it make it easier to remove the solder on the joints. Alright, I was able to resolder on the new capacitors. You can see one of the capacitors, or a few of them actually, are not placed exactly flush to the board because they were, once again, the capacitors, the new ones, are wider than the old ones, and they are kind of getting in the way of some of the components on the board. So after I resoldered the capacitors, I put the board back into the case, powered it up, and everything seems like it's powering up fine. I checked the offset voltages on the amplifier and everything seems to be normal. So right now we're going to be jumping into the sound impressions. So after listening to the amplifier with the new capacitors for about 2 hours, I came to the conclusion that the amplifier pretty much sounds exactly the same as it did before I replaced the capacitors. So all in all, I would not recommend that you replace these large capacitors for your 10-year or older KGSS amplifier, because it really doesn't make a difference in terms of the sound. And you are putting the amplifier in a very risky position of getting some of the solder pads broken or destroyed and basically breaking your amplifier. And so I really wanted to take this video to make a short review of this KGSSHV 500 voltage amplifier of mine. I really enjoyed this amplifier for a really long time, 5 years. And during that time, I always thought that the amplifier had a really thick sound. The bass was very strong and powerful. At times, I did feel like the amplifier was missing some high-end frequency emphasis. And that's why I eventually bought a KGSSHV Carbon. And the weird thing is that a lot of the information on the web says that the KGSSHV Carbon is superior to the regular HV amplifier in terms of bass. And initially, I kind of misinterpreted that statement because I thought that meant that the bass on the KGSSHV Carbon was more impactful, more stronger than the regular HV amplifier, but that really didn't turn out to be the case. And when I first listened to the Carbon, I was surprised that it wasn't very bass heavy as I was expecting. And so for a long time, for some reason, I didn't really like the sound of the Carbon. I think mostly it was because I had a DAC, the SMSL M500 DAC, which honestly didn't mix well with the Carbon's sound signature. And so right now I'm using a topping D90LE DAC, and this DAC is probably my favorite DAC of all time so far. It has a very balanced spectrum. It has a sound that is just a right amount of thickness and the right amount of low end and high end balance, and a liquid mid-range that I really enjoy. And I can't really find any fault in the topping D90LE. And so that's the DAC that I'm using as my primary DAC right now. And I find that with the regular 500 volt HV amplifier, which is the one I just replaced the capacitors on, the sound is too bass heavy, too bottom end heavy, and it's missing some high frequency emphasis. And so now, after 5 years of loving this HV amplifier, I very much prefer the KGSSHV Carbon over to this 500 voltage HV amplifier. And so the funny thing about high-end audio is that, you know, just one thing can make you prefer one amplifier or one headphone over another. And once you notice this one thing, or it's kind of like that meme where they say, like, you know, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So it's kind of the same thing with high-end audio in general. I find that the bottom end heaviness of the HV amplifier is just unacceptable to me now when I listen to it and when I notice it compared to the Carbon amplifier. And so I really mostly exclusively listen to the Carbon amplifier nowadays because I prefer the sound over the regular HV. Hopefully that helps you out in terms of figuring out which amplifier would be more suitable for your headphones. Basically, the Carbon is the best solid state amplifier that you can buy right now. Thanks for watching.